July 23, 1848. A man named Thomas Welcome Royes did something no one thought was possible. He sailed his ship, the Superior, through the Bering Strait into the Arctic Ocean. Most captains would never dare. The ice could crush a wooden ship like paper. His crew was terrified. Some were crying. Others threatened mutiny. But Royes had heard rumors, stories of massive whales in the frozen north. And he was right. Within 2 months, Royes and his crew caught 11 bowhead whales. These whales were enormous. Each one had a thick layer of blubber from feeding in the cold Arctic waters. That single trip produced 1,600 barrels of whale oil. That was the same amount most ships got in 3 years of hunting. Whale oil was everything back then. It lit homes across America. It kept machines running. Before petroleum was discovered, whale oil was the fuel that powered the world. One successful trip to the Arctic could make a captain rich beyond imagination. News of Royes' discovery spread like wildfire. The next year, 50 ships headed to the Arctic. The year after that, over 100 ships went north. They caught 2,000 whales in a single season. The bowhead whales learned fast. They became cautious. They hid in the ice. But the whalers kept following them deeper and deeper into dangerous waters. By 1871, the industry was desperate. Petroleum had been discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859. Whale oil was losing value. The whales were harder to find. Ships needed to stay longer in the Arctic to fill their holds. They needed to take bigger risks, and that summer, 40 ships were willing to gamble everything. August 1871. 40 whaling ships sailed north through the Bering Strait. They came from everywhere. 22 ships from New Bedford, Massachusetts, ships from Hawaii, ships from California, ships from New England. Over 1,200 people were on those vessels. Not just tough sailors either. These were families. Wives traveling with their captain husbands, children who called these ships home. Some captains spent their entire careers at sea, years and years away from land. The ships moved in groups like a floating community. On Sundays, they held church services together. Families would row between ships to visit. Children played while parents talked. These weren't just work vessels. They were homes on the ocean. The Inupiat people who lived along the coast tried to warn them. The weather was different that year. The wind patterns were wrong. The ice was behaving strangely. This was going to be a bad season. The locals knew the Arctic better than anyone. They had lived there for thousands of years. They understood the ice. The whaling captains didn't listen. The previous 3 years had been incredibly profitable. The weather from 1868 to 1870 had been perfect. Good catches, excellent conditions. Whaling from March all the way into September. The captains thought this year would be the same. Besides, the whales were plentiful. The hunt was good. They were making money. By late August, 33 ships were anchored along the coast near Point Barrow. That's the northernmost point in all of Alaska. They were packed tightly together. The ice was closer to shore than usual. There wasn't much room to move around. But the captains weren't worried. They expected the wind to shift from the east like it always did. That wind would push the ice pack away from shore. It would open a clear channel for them to escape south when autumn came. That wind never shifted. September 1st. The wind changed direction, but not the way the captains hoped. Instead of pushing the ice away, the wind blew from the southwest. The ice pack began moving toward shore. Fast. The ships were trapped between the ice and the land. The first ship to go down was the Roman. An ice floe struck it while the crew was cutting up a bowhead whale they'd just caught. The ship sank quickly. The crew barely escaped in small whaleboats. They rowed 20 miles south to other ships. The next day at 1 in the morning, the Comet was crushed by incoming ice. The grinding sound echoed across the water. The wooden hull cracked and splintered. The crew scattered to surrounding ships. A captain bought the salvage rights to the wreckage for $13. $13 for an entire whaling ship. September 8th brought a southwest gale. The winds pushed the entire fleet even closer to shore. The Elizabeth Swift ran aground. The crew managed to free it, but the Awashanks wasn't so lucky. It was crushed and lost forever. September 9th, 2 small ships tried to escape. The Kohola and the Victoria attempted to sail back south through the Bering Strait. Both ships ran aground and were destroyed. The ice was relentless. It didn't stop. It didn't slow down. One by one, ships were getting damaged, getting trapped, getting destroyed. The captains watched their vessels being crushed like toys. These were solid wooden ships, some over 300 tons. The ice didn't care. It ground them to pieces. William Williams was a young boy traveling with his father, a whaling captain. He later wrote about the power of the ice. He said there was a force within it that couldn't be expressed. It could only be partially comprehended. The sound alone was terrifying. The grinding, the cracking, the splitting of wood. Ships that had survived storms and years at sea were being torn apart. By September 11th, the situation was desperate. The captains held an emergency meeting aboard the ship Champion. All 33 captains gathered to make a decision. They had three options: stay with the ships and hope the ice melted, abandon ship and try to walk across the tundra, or attempt an evacuation by sea. Walking across the Arctic tundra was suicide. There was no food, no fuel, no shelter. The landscape was barren. They would freeze or starve. Staying with the ships meant certain destruction. The ice was getting thicker every day. Winter was coming fast. They would be trapped until spring. If they even survived that long. That left one option: evacuation by sea. September 12, 1871. The 33 captains signed a statement. It explained their decision. There was no harbor to shelter in. They didn't have enough provisions to feed everyone for 3 months. The countryside around them was bare of food and fuel. They had no choice but to abandon the ships. But here's what made this remarkable. 7 ships had managed to stay outside the ice pack. They were 70 to 80 miles south near Icy Cape. Those 7 ships promised to wait. They would rescue everyone. That's the whaling code. You never abandon your fellow sailors. The rescue ships were the Europa, the Arctic, the Progress, the Lagoda, the Daniel Webster, the Midas, and the Chance. But there was a problem. Those 7 ships were already loaded with whale oil and equipment. They were full. There was no room for 1,219 extra people. So the 7 captains made an extraordinary decision. They dumped their entire cargo overboard, thousands of barrels of precious whale oil, expensive whaling equipment. Everything went into the ocean. They emptied their ships to make room for the survivors. This cargo represented years of dangerous work. It was worth a fortune. They threw it all away to save lives. Back at the ice pack, the 33 trapped ships began their evacuation. Families packed what little they could carry. William Williams and his family left the Monticello, their home for 10 months. It broke their hearts. The ship was perfectly sound. It had taken them safely through so many dangerous situations. They left behind priceless souvenirs from the South Seas and Japan, personal treasures collected over years of travel, all of it abandoned. The whalers loaded into small whaleboats. These boats were designed to chase whales. They weren't made for long-distance travel in Arctic conditions. Each boat held maybe a dozen people. The boats were open to the elements, no protection from wind or cold or waves. Then they began the journey. 70 miles of Arctic Ocean, in September, in small boats, with women, with children, some as young as infants. Sometimes there was open water. The boats rode through freezing seas. Other times, the water was so choked with ice that the boats couldn't float. The men had to get out. They dragged the boats across solid ice. Picture this: grown men pulling heavy boats across jagged ice sheets. Women and children huddled inside trying to stay warm. Mile after mile after mile. The journey took days. Every mile was a battle. The weather could turn deadly at any moment. A storm would kill them all. The ice could shift and crush the boats. They could run out of food or water. Children could freeze. Anyone could fall into the frigid water and die within minutes. But something miraculous happened. Every single person made it. All 1,219 men, women, and children reached the rescue ships alive. Not one person died, not during the ice trap, not during the evacuation, not during the 70-mile journey. It was one of the greatest rescue operations in maritime history. The 7 rescue ships took on everyone. The Europa took 280 people. The Arctic took 250. The Progress took 221. The Lagoda took 195. The Daniel Webster took 113. The Midas took 100. The Chance took 96. These ships were packed far beyond their capacity. People were crammed into every available space. But they made it. The rescue ships sailed safely out of the Arctic. They headed to Honolulu. Many of the crew members were native Hawaiians. They went home. Other ships continued to San Francisco, to New Bedford, to their home ports. The 33 abandoned ships were lost forever. Well, almost all of them. In 1872, salvage companies tried to recover what they could. A company sent the ship Florence north. They found many of the wrecks. Some had been burned by the Inupiat people who scavenged the valuable wood. The salvage crews recovered 2 ships, the Minerva and the Seneca. They also collected tons of whale oil and whale bone. The Minerva could still sail on its own. But the Seneca had to be towed by the Florence. On the way back to San Francisco, a gale struck. The Seneca was lost at sea. In the end, they recovered about $10,000 worth of cargo. That was less than 1% of the total value lost. The financial impact was catastrophic. The total loss was valued at over $1.6 million in 1871 dollars. That's more than $51 million in today's money. 22 of the lost ships were from New Bedford, Massachusetts. Some shipping companies lost a third of their entire fleet. Several weren't even insured. The disaster destroyed families financially. It destroyed companies. It destroyed an entire industry that was already struggling. Combined with the discovery of petroleum in 1859, this disaster essentially ended the American whaling industry. Ships still went out after 1871, but it was never the same. 5 years later, in 1876, history repeated itself. Another 12 ships were lost to the ice in the same area. This time, 50 people froze to death. After that, Arctic whaling effectively died. For over 140 years, the ships sat at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. Forgotten. Lost. The ocean floor kept their secret. In 2015, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration launched an expedition. They called it the Search for the Lost Whaling Fleets of the Western Arctic. Using advanced sonar technology, they scanned the ocean floor near where the disaster happened. They were looking for any sign of the ships, and they found them. 2 shipwrecks, remarkably well preserved. The acoustic mapping revealed anchors, fasteners, ballast stones, brick-lined trypots that were used to render whale blubber into oil. The wrecks were flattened by over a century of ice pressure, but they were still recognizable as 19th-century whaling ships. Dr. Brad Barr, the project's co-director, said this was the first definitive proof of the lost fleet beneath the water. Until then, it was just a story. Now it was real. You could see the physical evidence. The ships were really there. The area where they were found averages only 28 feet deep. That shallow depth means most of the other wrecks were probably destroyed over time. The action of the sea and the ice grinding over them year after year would have pulverized the wood. But 2 survived, 2 witnesses to one of the greatest maritime disasters in American history. Today, the Arctic is changing. The same area that trapped those 33 ships in 1871 now has less ice. Climate change has transformed the region. The Northwest Passage that was impossible to cross is now sometimes ice-free in summer. Ships can sail through waters that would have killed sailors 150 years ago. The bowhead whales survived too. After being hunted nearly to extinction, they're making a comeback. Recent research shows that right whales, close relatives of bowheads, can live for over 130 years. Some bowhead whales alive today might remember when the whaling ships stopped coming. The story of the 1871 whaling disaster is a reminder of human courage and the power of nature. It's about captains who made impossible choices, about families who survived against all odds, about ships that took enormous risks for profit, and about 1,219 people who should have died but somehow all lived. The ice took 33 ships, but it took 0 lives. That's the miracle of 1871. Image prompts for each section.